The cold was a constant companion. It lived in the stone floors of the northern fortress, seeped through the worn leather of her boots, and settled deep in the bones of her bad leg. Petra had learned long ago not to complain. Complaining earned you a cuff from the head cook or, worse, the pitying glances of the other servants. She preferred invisibility. She dragged the heavy wooden bucket of slop across the courtyard, the rope handle digging into her palms. Her left leg protested with every lurching step, a familiar, grinding ache that started in her hip and ended in a fire behind her ankle. It was a reminder, a brand left by the past, ensuring she never forgot her place. She was broken, scraps, a servant girl with a useless limb in a world that valued strength above all else. The fortress hounds knew her. They whined softly as she approached, their tails giving hesitant thumps against the frozen mud. They were outcasts too, the old, the scarred, the ones too gentle for the hunt. Petra understood them. She tipped the bucket into their trough, then pulled a chunk of dark bread from the pocket of her apron. She broke it into pieces, her chapped fingers moving with practiced care, and offered it to the eldest hound, a gray-muzzled beast with one milky eye. He took it from her gently, his rough tongue a warm rasp against her skin. That was her life, a cycle of cold, pain, and small, stolen moments of kindness with creatures as forgotten as she was. She expected nothing more. She hoped for nothing more. Hope was a dangerous thing. It was hope that had shattered her leg in the first place. The storm came that night, a howling monster of wind and ice that rattled the shutters and screamed down the chimneys. It was a beast of a storm, the old-timers muttered, the kind that unearthed things best left buried. They weren't wrong. Just after midnight, the great doors of the fortress groaned open to admit a party of riders, their forms shrouded in snow and fur. They carried a man between them. He was a giant, a mountain of a man laid low, his blood a shocking crimson stain against the pristine white of the snow on his cloak. Panic erupted in the great hall. The fortress lord, a nervous man named Marius, fluttered around the wounded stranger like a moth around a pyre. Healers were summoned, servants scattered. Petra, tasked with fetching hot water, lingered in the shadows of the corridor, invisible as always. She could feel the power coming off the unconscious man in waves. It was a wild, untamed thing, like the storm outside. It felt of pine and winter, of old stone and fresh blood. It terrified the others. The healer's hands trembled as they cut away his tunic, revealing a torso latticed with muscle and a grievous wound in his side, 3 deep gouges, as if from some colossal beast. But beneath the raw power, Petra felt something else. A deep, resonant hum of pain. A grief so profound it felt like a physical weight in the air. It was a loneliness that echoed her own. "Get this filth out of here!" The head healer snapped, gesturing to the bloody rags. He was afraid. His fear made him cruel. Petra slipped into the room, her limp more pronounced under the weight of her sudden dread. She gathered the soiled linens, her eyes fixed on the stranger's face. It was a harsh face, all sharp angles and unforgiving lines, framed by a mane of dark hair matted with snow and blood. Even unconscious, he looked like a king from the old tales, a king who had fought a dragon and lost. She worked through the night, a ghost at the edge of the chaos. She fetched water, cleaned spills, and held her tongue. The man, who they simply called Leith, burned with fever. He thrashed against the restraints they'd tied to the bedposts, his low growls more animal than human. Twice he snapped the leather bindings. The healers gave up near dawn. "He is in the hands of the gods now," the eldest declared, washing his hands with a theatrical finality. "His wolf is too strong. It will consume him." Lord Marius wrung his hands. "He cannot die here. Do you know who he is?" The healer just shook his head and left. The others followed, leaving the dying man alone in the flickering candlelight. Alone, except for the crippled servant girl sent to clean the death room before it was a death room. Petra approached the bed. The heat rolling off him was immense. His skin was slick with sweat, his breathing a ragged, painful sound. The raw power was still there, but it was frantic now, a caged thing tearing itself apart. She reached out, a foolish impulse, and brushed a damp lock of hair from his forehead. His eyes snapped open. They were not the eyes of a man. They were gold, molten, feral, and utterly lost in a world of pain. A growl ripped from his throat, a sound that vibrated in her very bones. He was the beast. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She saw the torment in those golden eyes, the desperate plea behind the snarl. She stood her ground, her hand still hovering near his face. Slowly she began to hum. It was an old tune her mother had taught her, a lullaby about the mountain sleeping through the winter. It was a foolish, childish thing to do. But the growling lessened, replaced by a low rumble. The frantic energy in the room seemed to coalesce, the storm inside him finding a center. His golden eyes watched her, a flicker of something ancient and aware passing through them. Then they slid shut. His breathing deepened, evening out. The fever had not broken, but the fight had gone out of it. Petra stayed. She dipped a cloth in cool water and bathed his face. She spoke to him in low tones, telling him about the hounds, about the way the snow looked on the battlements in the morning. She told him he was safe. She wasn't sure if it was true, but she said it anyway. For 3 days she tended to him. The Lord allowed it, relieved to have someone, anyone, willing to enter the room. Leith drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes his eyes were a man's, dark and confused. Other times, they were the beast's, golden and watchful. The beast never growled at her again. It just watched, a silent, powerful guardian trapped within the wounded man. On the 4th day, he spoke. His voice was a rasp, rough as gravel. Water. Her heart leaped. She helped him drink, her arms supporting his heavy head. His eyes were his own today. They were the color of a stormy sky, shadowed and gray. He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time. His gaze traveled from her face down to her worn dress, and then to the way she favored her left leg. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his features. "Who are you?" he asked. "Petra, I'm a servant, my lord." He didn't correct the "my lord." He didn't say who he was. He was just Leith, a man who healed with unnatural speed. A man who watched her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. He insisted on her being his sole attendant. He refused food from any other hand. He tolerated the healer's visits with a silent, brooding stillness, but it was Petra he spoke to. He asked her questions, not about the fortress or its lord, but about her. "How did you hurt your leg?" he asked one evening, his voice soft in the quiet room. The question was a physical blow. "An accident, a long time ago." The lie was thin as winter ice. He knew. She could see it in his eyes. He didn't push. A strange, fragile peace grew between them in that sick room. It was a world of its own, made up of shared silence, the scent of herbs, and his steady, unnerving gaze. She found herself talking to him, telling him small things she'd never told anyone. He, in turn, remained a mystery. But sometimes, in the dead of night, she would hear him whisper names in his sleep, his voice thick with a grief that felt impossibly vast. A family, lost. The boundary was clear. He was a lord. She was a servant. But it was eroding with every quiet conversation, every time his fingers brushed hers as she handed him a cup. She was starting to feel something other than cold and pain. She was starting to feel hope, and that terrified her. The assassins came on the new moon. They moved like shadows, silent and swift, dispatching the guards with brutal efficiency. An alarm bell tolled, a frantic clanging sound that shattered the night. Petra's first thought was of Leith. She ran, her limp a clumsy, agonizing rhythm on the cold stone floors. She burst into his chambers. He was already on his feet, the moonlight from the window limning his powerful form. He was holding a sword that seemed to have appeared from nowhere, and he wore a look of lethal calm. "Stay behind me," he commanded. His voice was different, deeper, resonant with an authority that sent a shiver down her spine. 3 dark-clad figures appeared in the doorway. They moved with a liquid grace that wasn't human. Leith met them. The clash of steel was deafening in the enclosed space. He was magnificent, a whirlwind of controlled violence. He moved with a speed and strength that defied belief. He was no mere lord, but there were too many. A fourth appeared behind him, climbing through the window. Petra screamed a warning. Leith turned, but he was off balance. The assassin lunged, and then the change happened. A guttural roar exploded from Leith's chest. His form seemed to swell, his muscles bunching. His eyes blazed with that molten gold she remembered from his fever. Claws, black and sharp, burst from his fingertips. The beast was loose. He tore through the assassins. It wasn't a fight. It was a slaughter. The rage that poured off him was a physical force, a tidal wave of pure, primal fury. When the last man fell, the rage did not recede. He stood panting in the center of the room, chest heaving, his golden eyes wild and unseeing. He was lost in the red tide. He turned, and his gaze fell on the castle guards who had finally arrived, their swords held with trembling hands. He snarled, a low, menacing sound. He saw only threats. He began to advance on them. "No," Petra whispered. The guards would be torn apart. This magnificent, tormented creature would become a monster in truth. She didn't think. She acted. Remembering the old tales, the folklore her grandmother had called the bones of the world, she ran past him, ignoring the danger, and snatched a canister from a kitchen supply shelf. Salt. She moved between him and the terrified guards, her hands shaking so badly she could barely break the seal. She poured, a thin white line on the dark stone floor, a fragile barrier of kitchen seasoning against a force of nature. It was insane. The beast stalked forward. His massive, clawed feet stopped just short of the salt line. He lowered his head, sniffing at it. A low whine escaped his throat, a sound of confusion, not aggression. He looked up, his golden eyes locking onto hers, and in their depths, she saw a flicker of recognition, of pleading. He could not stop himself, but this simple line of salt, drawn by her hand, was a boundary his primal soul could not, or would not, violate. He paced the line, a caged tiger, the rage warring with some deeper instinct. Then the gold in his eyes began to recede. The claws retracted. The inhuman snarl softened into a human gasp. Leith, the man, stood there, breathing heavily, his storm-gray eyes wide with shock. He looked at the carnage. He looked at the trembling guards. And then he looked at her, standing behind her ridiculous, impossible line of salt. His expression hardened. The softness she had come to know was gone, replaced by the cold arrogance of a man used to absolute command. He was embarrassed. He was exposed. And he was furious. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice like the crack of a whip. "A ward," she whispered, "to calm the spirit." "My spirit does not need calming by a servant," he snarled. Pride. It was all pride. The man's pride was more dangerous than the beast's rage. And then he did it. He lifted his boot and stepped over the salt line. The simple act felt like a desecration. He broke the barrier his own primal nature had honored. He strode toward her and gripped her arm, his fingers biting into her flesh. "You will tell me what you are." It was at that exact moment that Lord Marius and the captain of the guard skidded into the room, their faces pale with terror. They saw the bodies. They saw the furious lord holding the servant girl. And they fell to their knees. "Your Majesty!" the captain gasped, his forehead pressed to the floor. "Forgive us. We did not know." "Your Majesty." The words hit Petra like a physical blow. Her legs gave out, not just the bad one, but both. Leith's grip was the only thing holding her up. She stared at him, at the harsh, beautiful face of the man she had tended, the man she had cared for. Not a lord. The Alpha King. The journey south was a blur of cold misery. King Leith did not speak to her. He did not even look at her. She was bundled into a supply wagon, treated not as a person but as a piece of strange cargo he was transporting back to his capital. The fragile world they had built in the sick room was shattered, its pieces ground to dust under the heel of his royal boot. She was a fool, a crippled servant who had dared to feel hope, who had dared to look at the sun and imagine it was for her. Now she was being dragged to the heart of his power, a place where she would be more insignificant than ever. The royal palace was not a fortress. It was a city unto itself, a breathtaking monstrosity of white marble and glittering towers that seemed to scratch at the sky. It was designed to make one feel small. It succeeded. Petra was assigned to the laundry. It was a clear, brutal statement of her place. She was returned to her station, the lowest of the low. The work was hard, the steam-filled rooms a humid hell, but the physical pain was a welcome distraction from the ache in her chest. She saw him sometimes, a distant figure in shining armor crossing a courtyard, or a powerful silhouette in a high window. He never acknowledged her. It was as if the days in the northern fortress had never happened, as if she had imagined the quiet conversations, the trust in his eyes, the way his beast had known her. Perhaps she had. Her only solace was the royal kennels. The hounds here were different. Sleek, powerful beasts, bred for war. But they, too, seemed to sense something in her. They would quiet when she passed, their intelligent eyes following her. A few of the older ones would even nudge her hand, seeking a touch. Her quiet affinity with the beasts did not go unnoticed. It earned her whispers. Witch. Sorceress. The whispers reached the ears of the one person in the kingdom more powerful than the king himself. The Dowager Queen, Althea, summoned her. Petra stood trembling in a solar so opulent it made her head spin. Silks and velvets draped every surface, and the air was thick with the scent of cloying, expensive perfume. Queen Althea was beautiful, with a brittle, cold perfection, her silver hair coiled in an intricate crown. Her eyes were the same stormy gray as her son's, but where his held a tempest, hers held only ice. "So," the queen began, her voice a silken threat, "you are the little cripple who thinks she has tamed my son." Petra said nothing. There was nothing to say. "He is grieving," Althea continued, circling her like a predator. "He lost his mate, his pups, his entire world. A man in such pain is vulnerable to parasites, clever little things who offer comfort and then sink their hooks in deep." She stopped in front of Petra, her gaze dropping to Petra's leg. "My son is the Alpha King. He requires a queen who is strong, whole, a wolf of pure blood to continue his line. You are none of those things. You are a broken stray he pitied. Do not mistake his momentary weakness for a permanent invitation." The words were like tiny, sharp shards of glass, each one finding a place to embed itself in Petra's already wounded heart. "Leave this place," the queen commanded. "Disappear. If you are here by the next full moon, I will have you thrown in a dungeon and forgotten. Am I understood?" "Yes, Your Majesty," Petra whispered, her voice barely audible. But where could she go? The world outside these walls had nothing for her. The man who had unknowingly given her a reason to hope had brought her here, only to abandon her to his mother's cruelty. The days that followed were a quiet torment. The other servants, taking their cue from the Dowager Queen, shunned her. Her food was spat in, her meager belongings were lost. Every corner she turned, she felt the weight of hostile eyes, and then her past arrived at the castle gates. Lord Valerius, the man who had destroyed her family, the man whose soldiers had held her down while he shattered her leg with the pommel of his sword, laughing as he did it. He was here, as a guest of the Dowager Queen. Petra saw him in the great hall, and the world tilted on its axis. The air rushed from her lungs. The same arrogant sneer, the same cruel eyes. He was older, but unmistakable. He was here, walking freely in the king's halls, honored and respected. She fled back to the laundry, her heart hammering against her ribs, the phantom pain in her legs so intense she could barely walk. That night, she couldn't sleep. She found herself walking the cold corridors, her path leading her, as it always did, toward the kennels. She needed the comfort of the hounds. She heard a sound from within, a low, pained whining. Pushing the heavy door open, she saw him, Leith, the king. He was sitting on the floor of the largest kennel, his back against the bars. Beside him lay his personal wolf, a massive black alpha named Nyx, who was the leader of the royal pack. Nyx was dying. A strange wasting sickness had taken hold of him, a sickness the royal healers could not cure. Leith didn't notice her. He was stroking the great wolf's head, his shoulders slumped. The king was gone. In his place was only a man, raw with grief, about to lose the last living link to his past. Nyx had been his father's wolf. "It's not fair, old friend," Leith murmured, his voice thick with unshed tears. "Everyone I love, everyone leaves." The agony in his voice was a physical thing. It reached across the room and squeezed Petra's heart. In that moment, he wasn't a king who had abandoned her. He was the man in the sick room, lost and drowning in pain. Without thinking, she stepped inside. He looked up, startled. His eyes hardened when he saw her. "What are you doing here?" "I heard him," she said softly, nodding toward Nyx. Sometimes I can feel their pain." She knelt beside the wolf, her hands hovering over his flank. She could feel the sickness, a cold, dark knot in the noble creature's life force. But she could also feel something else, the bond between wolf and king. It was a thread of light, frayed and weak, but still there. Her own hidden power, the strange affinity she'd never understood, stirred within her. It wasn't a fire or a light. It was an instinct, a knowledge. She knew what to do. Her power was an amplifier. It strengthened bonds. "Let me help," she whispered. "The best healers in the kingdom have failed," he said, his voice flat and hopeless. "They were trying to heal the wolf," Petra said, her gaze meeting his. "They should have been healing the bond." She placed one hand on Nyx's fur and, hesitating for only a second, placed her other hand on Leith's arm. The moment she touched him, it happened. A circuit completed. A spark jumped between the three of them, wolf, man, and woman. A warmth spread from her hands, a gentle golden light that only she could see. She wasn't creating healing. She was taking the love Leith felt for his companion, the dying loyalty Nyx felt for his master, and she was amplifying it, weaving the frayed threads of their bond back together, making it strong enough to push the sickness out. Nyx let out a long, shuddering sigh. The frantic, shallow panting eased. The cold knot of illness under her palm began to dissolve like frost in the sun. Leith stared, his jaw slack. He could feel it. He could feel the connection to his wolf, a connection he'd thought was fading forever, surging back to life, stronger than before. He looked from the wolf to Petra, his eyes wide with a dawning, impossible understanding. The moment was shattered by a cold, imperious voice from the doorway. "What is the meaning of this witchcraft?" The Dowager Queen stood there, her face a mask of fury, and beside her, smirking, was Lord Valerius. "I warned you, son," Althea said, her voice ringing with triumph. "I told you she was a sorceress. Now you see it with your own eyes. She bewitches your beasts. She will bewitch you next." Valerius stepped forward. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice oozing false sympathy. "I know this girl. She comes from a cursed line. Her family practiced dark arts. It is why they were destroyed. For the good of the kingdom." Petra flinched as if struck. Leith rose to his feet, his expression unreadable. He looked at his wolf, who was already trying to lift his head. He looked at his mother, her face alight with vicious victory. He looked at Valerius, the man he knew as a loyal ally. And then he looked at Petra, kneeling on the dirty straw, her face pale but her eyes defiant. The king was trapped. The entire court was watching from the corridor, drawn by the commotion. His mother, a master manipulator, had laid the perfect snare. To defend Petra would be to align himself with witchcraft against the word of a powerful lord and his own mother. To condemn her. He hesitated. That hesitation was all his mother needed. "Guards," Althea commanded, "seize the witch. She will be tried for treason and dark magic." Leith did not move. He did not speak. His face was a stone mask, his inner conflict so profound it was a palpable silence in the room. He was the king, but he was also a son, haunted by the ghosts of a family he had failed to protect. His mother was whispering poison in his ear, that this was how it started last time, with a woman who made him weak, who brought ruin. Petra saw the battle in his eyes, and her heart broke. He was going to let it happen. He was going to choose his crown, his duty, his grief, over her. The guards grabbed her arms, hauling her to her feet. The last thing she saw before they dragged her away was Leith's face, his expression torn, his eyes the color of a storm that could not break. He had abandoned her. The dungeon was cold, colder than the northern fortress, colder than her life had ever been. It was a deep, damp cold that promised death. Her trial was a formality, a piece of political theater staged by the queen. Valerius gave his testimony, a web of lies about her family's depravity. Others, coerced by the queen, spoke of Petra's unsettling influence over the castle's animals. She was found guilty. Of course she was. The sentence was death by fire at sunrise. Petra sat on the damp stone floor of her cell, the ache in her leg a dull, constant throb. But it was nothing compared to the void in her chest. She had let hope in, and it had destroyed her. Leith's hesitation in the kennel had been the final killing blow. He had seen the truth, felt the healing in his own bond with Nyx, and he had still chosen to let them take her. Hours passed. The darkness was absolute. She did not weep. She was hollowed out, beyond tears. A noise at the cell door. A key turning in the lock. A guard entered, his face grim. "The king is dying," he said, his voice a harsh whisper. "The Dowager Queen has made her move." Petra's blood ran cold. "Poison," the guard explained, pulling her to her feet. He was one of the few who had been at the northern fortress. He had seen what she could do. In his wine, Valerius and the queen's men hold the throne room. The loyalists are pinned down. He keeps calling a name. Your name. Her name. The guard led her through secret passages, the sounds of fighting echoing through the stone. He left her at a hidden entrance to the throne room, pressing a small knife into her hand. "The beast is loose, but the poison, it's driving him mad. He can't tell friend from foe. No one can get near him. You're the only chance he has." Petra peered through the grate. The scene was chaos. Leith was in the center of the room, surrounded. He was in his half-shifted form, the beast raging, but his movements were clumsy, uncoordinated. Black veins stood out on his neck, a sign of the poison. He struck out wildly, roaring in agony and confusion. His mother, Queen Althea, stood near the throne, a cruel smile on her face. Valerius was at her side. "You see?" Althea's voice cut through the din. "He was always weak. His father was weak. His first mate was weak. Love makes our line weak. I am merely purifying it. I did it for you, my son. I saved you from them then, and I am saving you from this stray, now." The truth hit Leith, even through his poisoned haze. His mother. She had orchestrated the attack that killed his family. Not an enemy, but his own mother, in a twisted attempt to make him strong. A cry of pure, soul-shattering anguish tore from his throat. The beast roared with him, a symphony of betrayal and agony. He lunged, not at his enemies, but at the nearest pillar, smashing his claws against the unyielding stone, maddened by a pain too deep to bear. He was destroying himself. Petra knew what she had to do. Her life was already forfeit, but his was not. She stepped out from the shadows. Every head turned. A gasp went through the room. The condemned witch, walking willingly back into the fire. "Petra," Leith rasped, his golden eyes fixing on her. There was so much pain in that one word. "Stay away from him, you creature!" Althea shrieked, signaling her men. They advanced on Petra. She did not even look at them. Her eyes were only for Leith. She saw the poison killing him, the grief consuming him, the beast raging without a master. She walked toward him, toward the vortex of claws and fury. She knew she would not survive. She knew his claws would tear her apart before the guards' swords could. It didn't matter. This was her choice. A final act of love in a life that had known so little of it. A sacrifice. She reached him. He was snarling, his mind almost gone. She did not flinch. She raised a hand, not in defense, but in comfort. She laid her palm flat against his chest, directly over his heart. The skin was burning hot, the muscles beneath trembling with poison and rage. "It's all right," she whispered, her voice clear and steady in the chaos. She poured every ounce of feeling she had for him into that touch, that single phrase. "I am here. You are not alone. Be at peace, Leith." The moment she chose his life over her own, the moment she offered love in the face of certain death, everything changed. It was not a wave. It was an explosion. A light, pure and white and blinding, erupted from her. It was the light of their bond, now fully forged in the crucible of her sacrifice, amplified 1,000 times over by her power. It surged from her hand into his chest, a cleansing fire. The black veins of poison vanished from his skin. The maddened rage in his eyes cleared, replaced by a sharp, focused intelligence. The clumsy, agonized movements smoothed into a perfect, lethal grace. The bond between them became a bridge. She could feel his strength, his power, his pain, and his love. And he could feel hers. He was not just healed. He was made whole. He stood straight, the beast and the man finally united. He looked down at Petra, his hand covering hers on his chest. His eyes were no longer gold or gray, but a fusion of both, glowing with a power none had ever seen. "Mine," he growled. The word was not a command. It was a fact, a truth that shook the foundations of the world. He looked up, and the occupants of the room froze. They were not looking at a mad king. They were looking at a god. He moved. Valerius was first. Leith was a blur of motion, disarming him and throwing him against a wall with contemptuous ease. The queen's guards fell, not slain, but broken and terrified. He cornered his mother against the throne. She held up a poisoned dagger, her face a mask of disbelief and fear. "I did it for you," she screamed, To make you strong. You made me an echo, he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. She, he said, looking back at Petra, made me a king. He did not kill her. He took the dagger from her hand, snapped the blade, and pronounced his judgment. Exile. She would live out her days in the silent northern fortress where this had all begun, stripped of her name, her power, her son. A fate worse than death for a woman like Althea. When the room was clear, when the traitors were rounded up and the loyalists were securing the castle, there was silence. There was only Leith and Petra. He walked to her, his movements no longer burdened by centuries of grief. He knelt before her, a king kneeling to a servant. He took her hand and brought it to his lips. Then his gaze fell to her leg, to the source of her old pain. He reached out and gently, reverently, touched the scarred, aching ankle. Warmth spread from his touch. It was not a magical healing that erased the injury. It was something more profound. It was acceptance. It was reverence. The chronic ache that had been her companion for years began to fade, replaced by a quiet strength. They broke you, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. And you saved me. You were never lost, she answered, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. Just waiting. He rose, pulling her to her feet, and gathered her into his arms. He held her as if she were the most precious thing in the world, the anchor that had saved him from the storm. Her head rested against his chest, and for the first time, she felt not the rage of the beast or the coldness of the king, but the steady, strong heartbeat of the man, of Leith. I love you, Petra, he said, the words muffled in her hair. I think my soul knew it the moment you hummed that song. I was just too afraid to listen. Tears finally came, but they were not tears of pain or fear. They were tears of relief, of release. I love you, she answered, and the words felt like coming home. 6 months later, the kingdom was transformed. The rule of King Leith and Queen Petra was firm, but just. The fear that had permeated the court was replaced by a grudging respect, and then a genuine loyalty. They saw a king who was no longer haunted, and a queen whose quiet strength was the bedrock of the throne. Petra still walked with a limp. It was a part of her, a map of her journey. Leith never looked at it with pity, but with pride. It was a reminder of the resilience of the woman who had faced down his beast and then healed his soul. They were in the royal gardens, the scent of roses thick in the summer air. Petra trailed her hand over a bush of white roses, their petals starting to brown at the edges. She focused, drawing on the quiet power of the bond that now perpetually hummed between her and Leith, and pushed a little of its vitality into the plant. The brown edges receded, the petals purling back to a pristine white. Leith came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. He watched the rose, then smiled against her skin. Show off, he murmured. She leaned back against him, a feeling of peace so profound it was almost dizzying. It was looking sad. Nothing in this garden is allowed to be sad anymore, he said, his voice soft but absolute. That is a royal decree. He turned her in his arms, his stormy eyes soft with a love that still, sometimes, stole her breath. He was not a beast, or a king, or a ghost. He was hers. And she, the broken servant girl from the forgotten north, was his. They were two halves of a fractured whole, made stronger in the breaking, and finally healed. Home.